What if I told you that you having a fear of God is actually blocking you from being able to have blessings in your life? What if I told you that you having a fear of God is actually blocking you from him elevating you to the highest possible level and magnifying and honoring and exalting his own name in your life? So in doing that, I have to explain to you, before I even start explaining to you how this works, I need to be able to illustrate to you that there are actually 3 different kinds of fears that we see laid out in the Bible. And you can say, well, there's actually 6, there's actually 7. There's this, there's that, you're missing all this. I'm saying for the sake of this lesson, we're going to actually just narrow them down to 3. Okay, so the first kind of fear we have is evil fear. What is evil fear? Well, let's find out. In order to find out what evil fear is, I have 2 different passages that I'm going to read to you, and then I'm going to explain to you the common thread in these passages. So, the first passage, we're going to start way at the very beginning, ironically, in Genesis chapter 3. So this is after Adam and Eve had been tempted to eat the fruit and their eyes were opened, right? So we're going to start off in verse 6. So Genesis chapter 3, verse 6. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree desirable to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate. She also gave to her husband with her, and he ate. Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they knew that they were naked. And they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves coverings. Verse 8. And they heard the sound of the Lord God walking in the garden in the cool of the day, and Adam and his wife hid themselves from the presence of the Lord God among the trees of the garden. Then the Lord called to Adam and said to him, Where are you? Verse 10. So he said, I heard your voice in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked and I hid myself. Okay. Now let's go to Exodus chapter 20. Verse 20. And this is actually what the verse that inspired this entire lesson. We're going to actually start at verse 18. Now, all the people, now for context, this is when God was descending on Mount Sinai to be able to give Moses the law to give to the Israelites. They were recently freed from Egyptian bondage by God. And now he's trying to give them the law that will actually set them apart as his own nation. This is verse 18. Now all the people witnessed the thunderings, the lightning flashes, the sound of the trumpets, and the mountains smoking. And when the people saw it, they trembled and stood afar off. Then they said to Moses, You speak with us, and we will hear you, but let not God speak with us, lest we die. Do you see what evil fear is? Let's go ahead and write these verses down. This is Exodus 20, 18 through 19. And then we have Genesis 3, 6 through 10. Did you catch the similarities between the fear that Adam and Eve had in Genesis 3 and the fear that the people of Israel had in Exodus 20, 18? Think about this. What did God tell us that Adam said? He said in verse 10, So I heard your voice in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked and I hid myself. Okay, let's go back to Exodus chapter 20. In verse 19, this is the Israelites talking to Moses. Then they said to Moses, You speak with us, and we will hear. But let not God speak with us, lest we die. This right here, this evil fear, is the kind of fear that cuts you off from God. This is the kind of fear that does not come from God. So we're going to point it downwards. This not only cuts you off from God, but what do we see here? Both of them desired to be in a state that actually drew them away from intimacy with the Lord. For the people of Israel, they were afraid and they said, we don't want God to come near us. But let's look at Adam and Eve's, because Adam and Eve's is really where we are able to see that this is the kind of fear that makes it so hard for you to be able to allow yourself for God to magnify himself in your life and to exalt you and elevate you to levels that you never thought possible. Because let's see here, what had they just done? They had just eaten the fruit. They had just eaten the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. And in response, they did what? Genesis 3 verse 8. And they heard the sound of the Lord God walking in the garden in the cool of the day. Now you have to imagine, before they sinned, this was probably a regular occurrence for him to walk in communion and harmony with them perfectly. But now they've sinned. And keep in mind, this is the first time anybody has ever sinned in human history. So nobody's ever experienced this before. This is unprecedented. So they heard the sound of the Lord God, which used to be a very cooling, calming, rejoicing, harmonizing feeling for them to walk with him. They hear him in the garden right now, in the cool of the day, and they hid themselves from the presence of the Lord God among the trees of the garden. So they ran away from him. Where they once operated in a perfect harmony with him, because of their shame and their guilt, they ran away from God. But let's figure out what else they did in their shame and their guilt. This is verse 7, right before he came to the garden. Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they knew that they were naked. And they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves coverings. Interesting. They made themselves coverings. Now, if you go to verse 10, when God asks, where are you to Adam? Adam says to God, I heard your voice in the garden and I was afraid because I was naked and I hid myself. Wait, hold on. I was afraid of what? I heard your voice in the garden and I was afraid. So he was afraid of God's voice. See, people go, oh, you have to have a fear of the Lord. Adam had a fear of the Lord. Adam was afraid of God. Adam and Eve were afraid of God, but they hid from him. Because of their shame and their guilt, they hid from God. But get this, this is what's really crazy. It says, and I was afraid because I was naked and I hid myself. Hold on. You were naked, Adam? I thought in verse 7, it told us that they sewed fig leaves together and they made coverings for themselves. So if you made yourself a covering, Adam, if you made yourself a covering, Eve, and then God comes to you and you say, I was afraid because I was naked, that means that what you just tried to do to cover up your own shame and to cover up your own guilt and to cover up your own sin is not enough. So what you just did was, instead of coming to God when he asked you, where are you? Remember, whenever God asks us a question, whenever Jesus, who is God in the flesh, asks anybody a question in the Gospels, he already knows the answer. When God asks you a question, he is trying to either give you an opportunity to invite him into the solution, to invite him into the problem so he can be able to make a way for you, or he is trying to give you the opportunity to come to an answer that he already has in store for you, should you open up your heart and listen to what he's asking you. Because when he's asking you, he's actually giving you the answer. God always asks you questions to give you the answer. So, hold on. You were naked and you made yourself fig leaves and you covered yourself up. But when God asks you, where are you? You said, I was afraid because I was naked. What does that mean? That means that you cannot do anything to cover up your own shame and your own sin and your own guilt. And not only did Adam try to cover up his shame and his guilt and his sin, but in doing this, he ran away from God. This is why this is the evil fear. Adam ran away from God. This is why the arrow is pointing down. It drew him away from God. Imagine that, and all that work you just did to hurry up and make fig leaves and sew them up to hide your own nakedness and then hide from God as he walks in the garden. Now you look at him or you see him and he's talking to you and you say, I hid because I'm still naked. You just did all that work for nothing. When God asked you where you were, he already knew what you did. When God asked Adam where he was, he already knew what Adam had did. He already knew what Eve had done. Whenever God asks you a question or asks anybody a question, he's asking so that he can draw you to the conclusion that he already has in store for you. Or he's asking so that you can invite him into the problem so that he can make a way to the solution for you. But instead of inviting God in, he ran away and he hid from God. He hid from him. And all that work he had just done and all that work they had just done to cover up their own shame, it didn't work and they still felt the need to hide from him instead of just making a way, or instead of just listening to God who can make a way and be able to restore them. This is why this is the evil fear. We're actually going to skip ahead a little bit and we're going to go to the law of the altar. This is Exodus 20:22. Then the Lord said to Moses, thus you shall say to the children of Israel. This is the same chapter we just got this from. This is just a few verses later. Verse 22. Then the Lord said to Moses, thus you shall say to the children of Israel, you have seen that I have talked with you from heaven. You shall not make anything to be with me, gods of silver or gods of gold. You shall not make them for yourselves. An altar of earth you shall make for me, and you shall sacrifice on it your burnt offerings and your peace offerings, your sheep and your oxen. This is God's altar. Pay attention to this. In every place where I record my name, I will come to you and I will bless you. And if you make me an altar of stone, you shall not build it of hewn stone, for if you use your tool on it, you have profaned it. Nor shall you go up by steps to my altar, that your nakedness may be exposed on it. Bro, is this not mind-blowing to y'all? Nakedness. So that your nakedness may not be exposed on it, so that your shame may not be exposed if you go up on my altar. Do not step on my altar, because even in trying to exalt yourself to my level, you will be exposing your shame. To exalt yourself to God's level is only to expose your own shame, because he will humble you. Back then, in these ancient times, right, people wore a lot of robes. So if they were to walk on top of the altar, it's like you walking on stairs. If they were to walk on top of the altar, it would have been like looking up their robe. That's why when God told Moses about what clothes the priests were to wear and what clothes Aaron and his sons were to wear inside the tabernacle, he said they have to be covered from pretty much from head to toe. There's never an instance where you should be able to look up their robe, to cover up their shame. Notice once again that when God gave the instructions for them to cover up their shame, that was not Moses coming up with how to cover up Aaron's shame or cover up Aaron's nakedness inside the tabernacle. That was God's instruction, not Aaron's, not Moses', not Aaron's sons. That was God's instruction on how to make the clothes to cover up the shame. Do you see the significance here, though? This is why. Because not only does it draw you away from God, let's look at this. Because Adam and Eve tried to make their own coverings to cover up their own shame, right? The first animal sacrifice, or the first blood sacrifice in the history of the world, was actually when God took that animal and killed it and made them skins to cover themselves up. That was the only time where they had no longer been naked after God had created them. Not when they made themselves fig leaves, not when they hid among the trees, when God made a blood sacrifice to cover up their shame. Sounds familiar, right? It's literally pointing to Jesus. It's literally pointing to Jesus, God in the flesh, coming down and dying, himself being the ultimate blood sacrifice to bring us into the new covenant. But let's look at this. Because for all that it does to separate you from God, what makes it even worse, what makes it absolutely evil, what makes this fear so awful, is when you try, like Adam and Eve did, to cover up your own shame. Let's see here. What did it say in Exodus chapter 20? What did it say in verse 25? And if you make me an altar of stone, you shall not build it of hewn stone. Wait, hold on. He said an altar of earth in verse 24, you shall make for me. An altar of earth. What this means is that God, if you do your, this is why you have to read the Bible and do research. You have to look up the historical context and the original Hebrew words. You have to look up what words mean, especially if you think you know what they mean. You have to go through and look up what these different words and these different translations mean so you can be able to get the full picture of what God was saying to them. Not only what it's saying to you right now, but also what he was saying to them specifically back then. So you can be able to apply that same wisdom to yourself. Why would you limit yourself to be able to receive everything from God's word by just reading it in your Bible and not going up in this modern age of technology and looking up what these different words mean? Okay, so he said, an altar of earth you shall make me. This means that they were to take stones that God provided from the earth and make God the altar. But he said right here in verse 25, if you make me an altar, you shall not build it of hewn stone. For if you use your tool on it, you have profaned it. If you use your tool on God's altar, if you use your tool to try to add your own creativity, which is something he blesses you with, or whatever you think is wise, whatever you think is beautiful to God's altar, you've profaned it. But when we look up that word profaned, look it up in the original Hebrew context, it's used in congruency and synonymously with polluted in other verses. In other texts throughout the Bible, that word profane, as used in Exodus 20, verse 25, is used with pollution. This is why I colored this in purple. This is the evil fear. This is the fear that cuts you off from God. This is the fear where you choose to be separated from God and where you choose to literally pollute what he's already done for you. The fig leaves are a pollution of what he could have done for you, or what he could have done for them, and what he actually still did for them because he loves you. What he still did for you on the cross because he loves you. To take the altar where you were to sacrifice animals for peace and for forgiveness, and to add something to it, to use your tools on it, instead of using the stones that God had already provided, that he deemed beautiful because he created them, instead of you saying, let me make it a certain shape, or put carvings into it, or engrave it in a certain way so I can think it looks beautiful, would have been to pollute what God had already done. This is why we know that if you cannot accept Jesus Christ's offer or sacrifice for you, it's either 100% good for you as it already is, or none of it is. Jesus Christ's sacrifice for you has to be 100% sufficient for your sin, or none of it is. You can't add anything to it. This is the evil fear. Now, not only are you separated from God, now not only are you saying to yourself, I don't even want to be around God, as the children of Israel said in Exodus 20:18, Moses, we don't even want to talk to him. You go talk to him. We don't want to be around him. We're too afraid of him. We have an evil, fleshly fear of God. The kind of fear because we know that he exposes our sin. The kind of fear because we know that he is holy and wrathful, but also loving and good. We don't want to be around him. Moses, you go talk to him. Or as we see in Genesis chapter 3, the same evil fear says, let me hide from God. But to make it even worse, let me pollute what he's already done for me. Do you see what I'm saying? It is almost impossible if you are operating in this evil fear for God to be able to use you the way he wants to. Because you are cutting yourself off from him actively. He desires to be magnified in your life. He desires to be exalted in your life. And he desires to elevate you as he does it. Not to elevate you to some kind of godhood or anything like that. I'm not talking about that. That's that new age stuff. I'm not talking about that. But what he desires to do is to allow you to bear his name. Do you see why you cannot have evil fear? Because before Adam and Eve sinned in the garden, I'm sure when God came down there, when he walked in the cool of the day, that was probably a regular thing. They probably walked and operated in communion and harmony with God all the time, in perfect harmony with him. Now we're going to talk about another kind of fear. This is the kind of fear where God can use you, where he can still magnify himself in your life. This is the fearless. So what is this fear? If this is evil fear, and this is having no fear, what's this third fear going to end up being? We're going to get to it. Okay, this is the fearless. Now, let's look at Daniel chapter 3. Just to be able to give you context, this is when King Nebuchadnezzar had made himself an image of gold and wanted everybody under him to worship this. Now, this is Daniel chapter 3, verse 1. Nebuchadnezzar, the king, made an image of gold whose weight was 60 cubits and its width 6 cubits. He set it up in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. And King Nebuchadnezzar sent word to gather together the satraps, the administrators, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image which King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Now, skipping ahead to verse 4, then a herald cried aloud, "To you it is commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that at the time you hear the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, and psaltery, and symphony with all kinds of music, you shall fall down and worship the gold image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up." Big no-no, obviously. This is verse 6. "And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace." So Nebuchadnezzar was saying, if you do not worship me, I'm going to cast you into the fire. Nebuchadnezzar was fearless. Nebuchadnezzar not only didn't fear shame like Adam and Eve did, he apparently had no shame. He didn't fear God. Nebuchadnezzar was fearless. This is going to be Daniel 3. Just read the entire chapter. I'm not going to write verses right here. Read the entire chapter, because we're going to skip ahead. So Daniel 3 verse 8. "Therefore at the time certain Chaldeans came forward and accused the Jews. They spoke and said to King Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, and psaltery, and symphony with all kinds of music shall fall down and worship the gold image. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have not paid due regard to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the gold image which you have set up." So, in reading this, we actually just got our third fear, but I'm not going to reveal to you what it is just yet, because we actually still have to go back to Exodus and 1 Samuel. I'm going to reveal to you what this third fear is. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in rage and fury, gave the command to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar spoke, saying to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the gold image which I have set up? Now, if you are ready at that time, you hear the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, and psaltery, and symphony with all kinds of music, and you fall down and worship the image which I have made. Good. But if you do not worship, you shall be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you from my hands?" Nebuchadnezzar was fearless. Who else was fearless? Let's go to 1 Samuel. Let's look at 1 Samuel 17. Now, obviously, this is one of everybody's favorite stories from the Bible. This is the story of David and Goliath. "And a champion went out to the camp of the Philistines named Goliath from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span." So obviously, Goliath was a giant. We already know this, right? So, "And a champion went out from the camp of the Philistines named Goliath from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a bronze helmet on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze." So he was really strong, obviously. "And he had a bronze armor on his legs and a bronze javelin between his shoulders. Now the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his iron spearhead weighed 600 shekels, and a shielded bearer went before him. And he stood and cried out to the armies of Israel and said to them, Why have you come out to line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and you the servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us. This, once again, in 1 Samuel, I'm listening to what Samuel 17, because as we're going to see in Daniel 3, and as we're going to see in 1 Samuel 17, we're actually going to go ahead and have you read these chapters, read both of these chapters entirely, so you can be able to understand not only what the fearlessness is, but what the third fear is going to be. So I'm going to put 1 Sam 17. Verse 10, and the Philistine said, the Philistine being Goliath, I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. But what y'all need to catch right here is that Goliath just made the biggest mistake he could have possibly made when he said, I defy the armies of Israel this day. Because what we end up seeing here is that these two men are fearless. But what this gives us is our third kind of fear, the singularity fear. Because when Goliath said, I defy the armies of Israel this day, let's look at what David said. This is going to be a little bit longer. I'm just going to read this entire thing, okay? I'm just going to continue on from verse 11. When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Now David was the son of the Ephrathite of Bethlehem, Judah, whose name was Jesse, and who had 8 sons. And the man was old, advanced in years in the days of Saul. Saul is the king of Israel right now. For context, for anybody who doesn't know, Saul is currently the king of Israel. So when it says in the days of Saul, it's saying in Saul's reign, Jesse, who was David's dad, was advanced in years. We're going to find out why that's important. The 3 oldest sons of Jesse had gone to follow Saul to battle. The names of his 3 sons who went to the battle were Eliab, the firstborn, next to him, Abinadab, and the third, Shammah. David was the youngest, and the 3 oldest followed Saul. But David occasionally went and returned from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. And the Philistine, this being Goliath, drew near and presented himself 40 days, morning and evening. Once again, we see this symbol of 40 over and over and over again. 40 days, morning and evening. Jesus was tested in the wilderness for 40 days after he was baptized. The Israelites wandered for 40 years before they got to the promised land. So for 40 days, Goliath tested the Israelites. God allowed the Israelites to be tested by Goliath. They didn't run away, but they couldn't find a way to defeat him. Because Goliath, who was fearless, made them forget who they were. At this time, as a nation as it existed back then, was God's consecrated nation. The second that Goliath said, I defy the armies of Israel, they should have known to have what? The singularity fear. And the Philistine drew near and presented himself 40 days, morning and evening. So for 40 days, the Israelites were tested. For 40 days, Goliath sat up here and cursed the armies of God, cursed the people of God, which they should have known meant he couldn't have won the battle. It doesn't matter how big he was. They should have known he couldn't have won the battle if he was cursing God and cursing God's armies. But because of his fearlessness, because of Goliath's fearlessness and how big he was, they thought to themselves, we've forgotten who we are based off whose we are, and they refused to go fight him. They refused to send anybody to go fight him. Think about that. Somebody else's fearlessness, somebody else thinking that they don't need to rely on God. This fearlessness means that you don't not only fear no man, you don't fear God. This right here is still how God can be able to exalt himself in your life. We're going to find out how. Then Jesse said to his son David, take now for your brothers an ephah of this dried grain and these 10 loaves, and run to your brothers at the camp, and carry these 10 cheeses to the captain of their 1,000, and see how your brothers fare, and bring back news of them. So their dad just sent David. David's dad and their brother's dad just sent David out to go check on his brothers. I want you to imagine this. What's happening right here? Let me just use this marker. What's happening right here is Israel's army is right here. The Philistines' army is right here. It's like in one of those old like fantasy movies or war movies. Instead of having everybody come to fight at once, the Israelites should send a champion. The Philistines are going to send a champion. The Philistines send Goliath. I'm going to make them really big right here. The Philistines send Goliath. The Israelites who were so afraid, even though Goliath just cursed the armies of God, which means he cursed God himself, they don't know who to send. They're not so afraid that they run away, but because of Goliath's fearlessness, because he doesn't fear anything at all, they forgot that they fear God and that they belong to God, so they should still be able to go and kill Goliath. But we're going to see somebody here who had the singularity fear. So David rose early in the morning, left the sheep with the keeper, and took the things and went as Jesse, his father, had commanded him. And he came to the camp as the army was going out to fight and shouting for the battle. For Israel and the Philistines had drawn up in battle array, army against army. And David left his supplies in the hand of the supply keeper, ran to the army, and came and greeted his brothers. Then he talks with them. There was the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, coming up from the armies of the Philistines. And he spoke according to the same words. So for 40 days and 40 nights, he's coming up out here cursing Israel. For over a month, he's coming up here every day at sunrise to curse Israel and to curse the armies of their God, which means he's cursing God himself. He's not saying, oh, well, Israel's weak, Israel's fearless. He's saying Israel's weak and Israel's fearless. But what he's really saying is your God is weak. I don't fear you. I don't fear your God. I fear no man, and I definitely don't fear the God that they serve. So for 40 days and 40 nights, he's doing this. So David heard them as in his words. And all the men of Israel, when they saw the man being Goliath, fled from him and were dreadfully afraid. Dreadfully afraid. Once again, they fear Goliath more than they're fearing God. Anyway, so the men of Israel said, have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel. And it shall be that the man who kills him, the king will enrich with great riches, will give him his daughter, and give his father's house exemption from taxes in Israel. Here is a reward for you if you can go kill Goliath. That's what they're saying. Then David spoke to the man who stood by him, saying, what shall be done for the man who kills the Philistines and takes away the reproach from Israel? David just heard what he said. David was already saying it right there. He heard what the reward was. He was making sure that he could get somebody else to say it again to confirm what the reward was. So then David spoke to the man who stood by him, saying, what shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? David has singularity fear. David, because he fears God, David doesn't care how big Goliath is. Everybody else here is afraid of Goliath because of his size. Everybody else here is afraid to fight him. These are all grown men, by the way. David, who was just a boy at this time, was like, wait, hold on. He was, what did he just say? He cursed who? Oh yeah, he can't win. There's no way he can win. David, because he fears God, this is the singularity fear. He says, I'm going to go fight Goliath. And the people answered him in this manner, saying, so shall it be done for the man who kills him. This is them confirming to David what the price was that the king, who was Saul, was going to give to the person who killed Goliath. Now Eliab, his oldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men. And Eliab's anger was aroused against David. And he said, why did you come down here? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? Because remember, David was a shepherd. That was David's entire thing, was actually to shepherd sheep when he was a boy. That was his whole job. So his brother's like, why did you leave the sheep? You left the sheep, and we're going to say what he says here. I know your pride and the insolence of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle. He's like, bro, you're my little brother. Like, you came down here to be nosy and to see the battle because you're arrogant and you're hard-headed. David said, what have I done now? Is there not a cause? Then he turned from him toward another and said to the same thing. And these people answered him as the first ones did. So he's getting it from everybody else what his reward is if he kills Goliath. Now when the words which David spoke were heard, they reported them to Saul, and he sent for him. Then David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant, don't let no man's heart fail because of Goliath. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine. And Saul said to David, judging him by his size, but not his fear of God, said, you are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are a youth, and he a man of war from his youth. He's saying, David, you're only a boy. This is not only a giant, but a man who was trained to kill people since he was a boy. But you know what? David has feared God since he was a boy. David, no matter how much Goliath trained for war, because David has feared God since he was a youth, has more power than Goliath as a youth than Goliath does as a grown man who's been training to kill people since he was a boy. Saul saw what Goliath had done, once again, since he was a youth, but he forgot to acknowledge who David has feared since he was a youth. David has singularity fear. But David said to Saul, your servant used to keep his father's sheep, and when a lion or a bear came and took a lamb out of the flock, I went out after it and struck it and delivered the lamb from its mouth. And when it arose against me, I caught it by its beard and struck it and killed it. This is a boy killing lions and bears. Why? Because he had a fear of the Lord to do his assignment, which was to watch the sheep. So because if he can have a fear of God to kill lions and bears, he ain't going to be afraid of no giant. He's not afraid of God. Doesn't matter how big Goliath was. Your servant has killed both lion and bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, seeing he has defied the armies of the living God. Moreover, David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. So once again, because David fears God, he's not going off his own might. He's saying God delivered me from the paw of the bear and from the mouth of the lion. I was able to kill these lions and these bears to protect the sheep because I fear God, and God protected me. If God can protect me from these bears and these lions, there's nothing God cannot do to this Philistine who literally just cursed him. Don't you understand that because these people were fearless, because they don't fear God, it doesn't matter if they don't fear you. They don't have to fear you. Because they don't fear God, you have to know that they cannot win. You have to know that what does not fear God cannot win, because God wants to do what? Exalt himself in your life and use you to magnify himself over the fearless. That's what David was saying. David was like, man, I mean, I don't even think it doesn't even sound like David was scared. But you have to catch this. You have to understand that it wasn't that David wasn't scared because of his own might. It wasn't even that he wasn't scared because of his own experience. He wasn't scared because he knew the God that he served. And he knew that there was no way Goliath was about to sit up here and curse God like that and curse God's armies. So, that being said, we now have an example of singularity fear in David. I'm going to tell you how David's story ends. Well, we already know how David's story ends. He kills Goliath. He goes up there, and before Goliath can even get a single shot off, David takes a stone from the brook, puts it in his bag, walks up to Goliath, and as he's running up to him, getting ready to fight him, takes a slingshot, throws a stone, hits him in the head, and kills him instantly. But I'm going to read it for you, because there's detail in God's word more than there's detail in how I can explain it to you. So skipping ahead to verse 40. Then he took his staff in his hand, and he chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook and put them in a shepherd's bag. He's taking the stones that God provided for him already in a brook. He said that it doesn't matter if Goliath has these spears and these helmets and this armor that weighs 1,000 shekels or 500 shekels. He can make these things with tools, but God has already provided for me. What God has provided for me, and that I need not take any tool to, will be enough to kill this man. Do y'all see what I'm talking about, bro? Think about that. The stones that he took from the brook, he used no tool on them. These were provided by God and perfect to be used to magnify God by killing Goliath, by taking out the fearless. The fearless as in somebody who does not fear man or the God that we serve. David knew he needed to add nothing to these stones that God had already provided. He need not profane, as we see in Exodus 20, profane with a tool what God had already provided. Man, you can't tell me this isn't life, bro. The Holy Spirit is flowing. You cannot tell me this isn't life-changing stuff. Okay. What do you have right now? Let me ask you that. What do you have right now? Let me ask you, what shame do you have right now? And you're saying to yourself, I can't overcome this shame. I'm ashamed of my past. I'm ashamed of my mistakes. So therefore, I'm fearful because I know that God is holy. And I don't want to stand in his presence. I can't bring these things to him. Even though he's provided me with what I need to be able to talk to him. He's provided me with what I need. He's already made a covering for me in the form of himself when he put on the flesh to die for your sins on the cross. You're saying I'm ashamed of my sin. God is telling you, I made myself to be sin so that you could be able to be free. So you cannot have evil fear. Let me ask you this too, speaking of David. Or actually, let me ask you this first. What in your life right now are you afraid of? Are you afraid to stand against, even though it has no authority over God? And not only does it have no authority over God, it doesn't even fear him. It doesn't even know him. But how can you cling on to him for that dominion? How can you cling on to God for that dominion? What is he telling you right now? Think about it and pray. Pause the video if you need to. Think about it and pray. What right now in your life cannot submit to God, that faces you as an adversary in your assignment, that stands against you to defy God? Not even to defy you, because it's not about you. It's not about me. It's not even about us. It's about the God that we serve. The enemy, yes, I believe in Satan. I think Satan is real. Satan wants to take what does not fear God and use it in your life to make you forget that you should be fearing God. And in doing so, you can either have evil fear or you can become fearless. Neither of which is good. What in your life right now do you know does not submit and honor and love and worship God that you're afraid of? It doesn't matter if it honors or worships God or not. It has to submit to him no matter what. Let me ask you this too. It says that when David picked up the smooth stones from the brook, he put them in a shepherd's bag. He put the stones that God provided for him in his shepherd's bag. That was what he brought with him to war. He didn't bring a spear. He brought a slingshot, but the slingshot was what he was using to kill the bears and the lions. He didn't bring a spear. Excuse me. He didn't bring a spear. He didn't bring a sword. He didn't bring a shield. And then when he took what God had provided for him to make a way against the fearless, against the evil, he took it and he put it in something he already had that God had provided for him in the previous chapter. What from your previous chapters in life right now are you ignoring? He didn't put it in a weighted bag of gold, a 50 shekel weighted bag of gold. He didn't have somebody bearing his stones for him like Goliath had somebody bearing his shield. He didn't have any of that. He took what was his previous assignment and used it so that God can be magnified right now. He didn't say this shepherd's bag isn't good enough. He didn't say these stones weren't good enough. What has God already provided for you that you refuse to be grateful for and use right now? Think about that. Okay. So, then he took his staff in his hand and he chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook. His staff, his little walking stick. Bro, imagine this little boy walking up with a walking stick in a shepherd's bag. If Goliath ain't afraid of God, he ain't going to be afraid of him. That's the problem. He doesn't need to be afraid of God for God to magnify himself and exalt himself over it. Your problems don't need to recognize God for you to recognize God. What stands against you right now, be it a person, be it a circumstance, a situation, does not need to honor God for you to still honor God. And put them in a shepherd's bag, and a pouch which he had, and a sling was in his hand. And he drew near to the Philistine. He went in. He going in head first. Once again, what do you have right now that you can be using at your disposal to go in? Once again, we just talked about this. We just talked about this last week. We were talking about the Israelites when Moses said, be still, and everything else he said in the sentence to not be afraid and to see the salvation that the Lord will grant for you today. Everything else he said was good except for be still. The Israelites were being still. Pharaoh didn't fear God. Pharaoh defied God over and over and over. God had struck them with plagues, killed his firstborn. Pharaoh still defied God. Guess what happened to Pharaoh? Well, from history, Pharaoh actually survived. But guess what happened to his armies? His choice armies. Remember, we talked about that. Pharaoh's choice armies, his chariots and his captains, and the choices of men and the choices of horses that he took and deployed out against the Israelites, against God's people, drowned. But remember, God said, why are you crying out to me, Moses? Tell them to go forward. Right here, the Israelites. Why are y'all sitting here for 40 days? He just cursed God. He can't win. There's no way he can be able to win. He just cursed God. They stood still for 40 days. Here's somebody who has the singularity fear. I'm not saying the Israelites didn't fear God, but I'm saying that them seeing Goliath's fearlessness made them forget the God that they fear. Even if it didn't make them forget the God that they fear, it made them forget what he can do for them. Because if you could remember that, if you could hear him cursing God and remember that, you would have never been sitting still. David heard it and it was like, David had only been there for a day. It was like, I'm just going to go in now. And thank the Lord that these 2 lessons actually happen to tie together. 2 lessons, 2 weeks in a row, happen to be able to tie together in some way. They all tie together in some way, but thank the Lord that he's speaking through me right now to reveal to y'all how these things from this week and the things from last week have some sort of common factors. Have common principles to be able to apply. Because you serve the same God no matter what week you're watching this in. So the Philistine came and began drawing near to David, and the man who bore the shield went before him. And when the Philistine looked about and saw David, he disdained him, for he was only a youth, ruddy and good looking. So the Philistine said to David, am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. The birds of the air and the beasts of the field, who God created? Do you see what I'm saying? He's not only cursing David, did he just sit up here and curse the armies of God, which means to curse God? He's saying, you're coming from the armies of God. You have the singularity of fear. You're going to come from the armies of God. I'm going to feed you to God's own creation. He does not recognize God's authority. Do you think that God was going to let David sit up here and have Goliath? Do you think that God was going to let Goliath, who was cursing him for 40 days and 40 nights, sit up here and feed the person with the singularity of fear to his own creation? Then David said to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword, with a spear, with a javelin, with all these things you already mentioned. But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you and take your head from you. And this day I will give the carcasses of the camp of the Philistines to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, and that all the earth that may know that there is a God in Israel. Not so all the earth can know how great I am. Not so all the earth can know how awesome David is. So all the earth can know that there's a God in Israel. Let me ask you this. When you want to have victory over the things that are plaguing you right now, who are you doing it for? I'm not saying you shouldn't want freedom. I'm not saying you shouldn't want release. But are you doing it for God's glory? Do you wish for God to be magnified? Do you wish for yourself to be lesser so that he can become greater, as John the Baptist said? Okay. Then all this assembly shall know that the Lord does not save with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's. David said, this battle is God's. It's not even mine. You just cursed God. It's not even about me. And he will give you into our hands. But notice this. You have to get this. Yes, God, the battle is God's. Yes, God was going to give Goliath into their hands. But what could they not do? Sit around for 40 days and let him just curse God. You have to move forward. So it was when the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David that David hurried and ran toward him, or toward the army, to meet the Philistine. Then David put his hand, ran toward him. He's not walking anymore. He's like, it's up. He's ready to go. Then David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone, and he slung it and struck the Philistine in his forehead, so that the stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the earth. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. But there was no sword in the hand of David. He went out there without a sword. Therefore David ran and stood over the Philistine, took his sword and drew it out of his sheath and killed him and cut his head off with it, and cut off his head with it. Just like he said he was going to do. He said, I'm going to give your head to our army. But he didn't even have a sword. He took Goliath's sword from him and cut his own head off with it as a trophy. I'm going to go somewhere with that. He took Goliath's sword and cut Goliath's head off. I'm going to do this so you can see. Cut his own head off with it. Now, remember what Goliath said when he was out there cursing God. He said, if you beat me, we'll serve you. If we beat you, you have to come and serve us. And when the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. They didn't stick around to be served. They didn't want to serve God. They fled. They ran away. And when the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. Now the men of Israel and Judah arose and shouted and pursued the Philistines as far as the entrance of the valley and to the gates of Ekron. And the wounded of the Philistines fell along the road to Shiraim, even as far as Gath and Ekron. Gath, that's where Goliath was from. Then the children of Israel returned from chasing the Philistines. They're like, okay, let them go. Like, whatever, right? And they plundered their tents. And David took the head of the Philistine, Goliath, and brought it to Jerusalem, and he put his armor in his tent. He just took this man's head and armor as a trophy. The same armor that he said made him greater than David. It didn't make him greater than God, though. And David just took that armor from him. He's dead now. He cursed God and he died, and now his armor that he thought made him greater, and his size that he thought made him greater, can't do him any good now because he defied God. Okay. That's 1 Samuel. We still got to look at, I know this is long, we still got to look at Daniel chapter 3. We still have to look at Daniel chapter 3 because we're going to see another example of how somebody who has singularity fear. So let's put 1 Samuel 17 right here as well. We still have to be able to see how somebody who has singularity fear, or people who have singularity fear, can be able to be used for God to exalt himself over the impossible. A little boy just killed a giant. A little boy with a slingshot and some stones just killed a giant with armor who had been trained to kill since he was a kid. Okay. Let's go back. Let's pick back up in Daniel chapter 3. Because we already know, right, that Nebuchadnezzar said, if you do not bow down to this statue of me and worship it and worship my gods, I'm going to throw you in the furnace and there's no God who can save you. That's what he thought, at least. So let's pick up right there. Let's pick up in Daniel chapter 3, verse 15. Now, if you are ready, at the time you hear the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, and psaltery, and symphony with all kinds of music, and you fall down and worship the image which I have made, good. But if you do not worship, you shall be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you from my hands? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If that is the case, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace. They fear God. They know what God is able to do. But catch this, because they fear God, and he will deliver us from your hand, O king. But because they fear God, catch this, verse 18. But if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we do not serve your gods, nor will we worship the gold image which you have set up. Because we fear God, we know that he's able to save us. We know Daniel chapter 3. We know that God is able to save us. But because once again, because we fear him, what we also will not do is bow down to you. It don't matter what you do. It doesn't matter how hot this furnace is. It doesn't matter what you do. It doesn't matter what you threaten us with. It doesn't matter if you have swords and spears and shekels of armor or a furnace. It doesn't matter. We will not bow down to you because, yes, we fear our God. We know he can save us. But because we fear him, we will not worship anything outside of him. Let me ask you this. Let me ask you this. Do you fear God enough in these moments where God is trying to reveal to you this singularity fear, as we're calling it here for this lesson? In these moments where God is trying to conjure up within you and magnify himself by the singularity fear, do you come to worship other things? Do you say, this can get me out of this situation? That can get me out of this situation? It'll be money. It'll be a certain lifestyle. It'll be that girl, that guy, that job. I'm not saying that these things are bad. But what I'm saying is, do you think that these things are going to get you out of the situation instead of God? You have to decide what you're not going to worship so that God can magnify himself. Because as we see, God's going to magnify himself no matter what. As we saw with the fearless, God magnified himself over Goliath. You can be fearless. This is what you don't want to be at all. You don't want to be this either. But even if you're fearless, God can magnify himself. He can magnify himself over the evil fear too. I'm saying that you want to be used though. But if you want to be used, not in the wrong way, you don't want to be the fearless. When circumstances arise and when the adversaries who you have in your life, whether they be people or circumstances or situations, when they arise and they strike, do you say to yourself what David said? That this battle is the Lord's? It's him who needs to be magnified. It's him who can come in and save me. Not money. I'm not saying money's bad. He might do it through money. He might do it through a relationship. He might do it through a lifestyle or a job or a car. He might do it through that. But that's not what's to be worshipped. He is the giver of these things. Think about what David had. He had a stone, a shepherd's bag, and a slingshot. But because God was who he served, what did he leave with? He left with a stone, a slingshot, a shepherd's bag. He also left with a giant's head and a giant's armor. God did not need what Goliath had to be able to magnify himself. God did not need to give that to David to be able to magnify himself. But after David was humble and served God, God gave it to him anyway. What do you have in your life right now, once again, that you can use, that you can be grateful for? How can you be humble to God when the adversary strikes? When you say this furnace or this fire that I'm going through, that I'm walking through right now, God, it's too hot for me. And you're not going to worship what's hurting you. You're not going to worship the hardship. But don't fall into the trap of worshiping the things that you think can get you out of the hardship before you just worship. Don't worship them at all. But don't fall into the trap of worshiping them instead of worshiping God, who wants to free you. Because it's not about you. It's about him magnifying himself. Now they said, but if not, if God does not save us, they said he can, but even if he doesn't, this is the kind of fear you need to have too. Even if he does not rescue you, I'm still not going to worship the other things, because his will is sovereign, because he's God. His will is sovereign. He can do whatever he wants, because God owes you how much again? What does God owe you? Nothing. They could have been thrown into this fire and died. They could have been thrown into this fire and burned alive and killed. Even still, they said, we're going to worship God. We will not worship any other gods. We will not worship you, Nebuchadnezzar. Do you have that kind of fear? Do you have the singularity fear? You are only afraid of God. I'm not saying there aren't other dangers. I'm not saying there aren't other things to be cautious of. But what did Jesus say? He said, instead of fearing those who can destroy your flesh, fear your Father who in heaven, who can destroy both your flesh and your spirit. Matthew 10:28. He said, do not be afraid of those who kill the body but cannot kill the soul. Instead, fear the one, God, who can destroy both soul and body in hell. Picking up in verse 19. Then Nebuchadnezzar was full of fury, and the expression on his face changed toward Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He spoke and commanded that they heat the furnace 7 times more than it was usually heated. And he commanded certain mighty men of valor who were in his army, mighty men of valor. Man, these are like the toughest men in the army. The toughest men in the army are going to walk Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego up to this furnace to kill them. And he commanded certain mighty men of valor who were in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their coats, their trousers, their turbans, and their other garments, and were cast into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Therefore, because the king's command was urgent and the furnace exceedingly hot, the flame of the fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The flame of the fire killed the men who took them up when they went to go cast them in. The flame of the fire, which they had no fear over because they feared God, just killed another example of the killing the fearless. The weapons of the fearless were used to kill the fearless because they defied God. The weapon of Goliath was used to cut his head off and put as a trophy in David's tent because Goliath defied God. How can you fear what is fearless when you fear God? Don't you know he wants to exalt himself over these things? And it's not about you, but don't you know that he loves you and wishes to use you in it? And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down bound in the midst of the burning fiery furnace. The king Nebuchadnezzar was astonished, and he rose in haste and spoke, saying to his counselors, did we not cast 3 men bound into the midst of the fire? They answered and said to the king, true, O king. Look, he answered, I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire that just killed the 3 mighty men of valor who were fearless and didn't fear God. Because if they had to fear God, they would have been like, no, you can throw us in there with them. We're not going to bow down to you, nor are we going to kill them for fearing God. Throw us in there with them. This fire that just killed these men who didn't even go into the furnace. They just opened up the doors. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, he says, I see 4 men loose walking in the midst of that same fire, walking in the midst of the fire. and they are not heard. And the form of the fourth is like the Son of God. That's a whole different lesson. The form of the fourth, who was in there with them, was Jesus. This is a pre-incarnate Christ, helping people, saving people who worshiped him, who feared him, even if they didn't know who Jesus was yet, even if God had not revealed himself in the Trinity to these people yet. Now, this is what gets so crazy. This is what gets so nuts. The Philistines fled away from the Israelites because you cannot contend with God. They cannot contend with God. Nobody can contend with God. They fled away from the Israelites after David had killed Goliath. Nebuchadnezzar, who just questioned, what God is going to be able to save you from my hand when I throw you in this fire? And that was before he turned it up 7 times hotter. Then Nebuchadnezzar went near the mouth of the burning fiery furnace and spoke, saying, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God. He now has to recognize God's authority. Graciously enough, God let him live. He has to recognize God's authority now. Servants of the Most High God, come out and come here. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came from the midst of the fire. And the satraps, administrators, governors, and the king's counselors gathered together, and they saw these men on whose bodies the fire had no power. The hair of their head was not singed, nor were their garments affected, and the smell of fire was not on them. They didn't even smell like fire. There was no effect on them. Nebuchadnezzar spoke, saying, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his angel. Now, that's a whole different conversation, but when you see his angel or the angel of the Lord and the A is capital, it's usually actually God himself, but presenting himself to you or to the people who he's speaking to in the form of an angel. He did this in Exodus when he was helping the Israelites be free. He did this when he was guiding them through the wilderness. He's doing it right now. He did it again in Joshua. He does it a lot. But this angel in capital A is usually actually God. Not saying that God is an angel. God created angels. But I'm saying that when he presents himself to these people, sometimes he did it through an angel who was actually him. He would manifest himself through an angel, through his angel. But anyway, who sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him. And they have frustrated the king's word and yielded their bodies that they should not serve nor worship any God except their own God. Therefore, I make a decree that any people, nation, or language which speaks anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut in pieces, and their houses shall be made an ash heap. So they're going to burn their house down because there is no other God who can deliver like this. He said it himself. He just sat there and said, who's going to deliver you from my hand? And then when God showed up and delivered them, he said, what God can deliver like this? Because of the singularity fear of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Because of the singularity fear of David. The people who were oppressed, God's own people, are now saying, who can possibly be like this God? And you're afraid of this? Instead of being afraid of the God who just who let them be in the fire and didn't even burn them and stood in the fire with them. You're afraid of the fearless. And we see here that the fearless always have to answer God eventually, no matter what. God literally bought the fearless. Once again, they did not fear God. He brought them to their knees. Let me go to Exodus chapter 20, and I'm actually going to end with this, okay? Is it not crazy to you that there is so much crossover right here? Because Exodus chapter 20, we saw verses 18 through 19, it had the evil fear when the people were saying, Moses, we don't want to go talk to God. You go talk to him and you tell us what he said. Report back to us about what he said. We don't want to go talk to him. We're afraid of him. I want you to see here. This is actually the verse that inspired this entire lesson. Moses' response to them in Exodus chapter 20, verse 20. This is literally what he responds, what he says to them right after verse 19, when they said, we don't want to talk to God because we're afraid of him. You go talk to him. You tell us what he said. Verse 20, and Moses said to the people, do not fear, for God has come to test you, and that his fear may be before you, so that you may not sin. Isn't that interesting to you? In the same breath, he said to them, do not fear and be afraid. This is how the Holy Spirit awoke me to the fact that there are multiple kinds of fear. Because so much throughout the Bible, and of course there are, you go, well, yeah, don't be afraid, but be afraid of God. But we see other people who were afraid of God right here in Exodus and in Genesis who didn't want to speak to him, who didn't want intimacy with him. And Moses said to the people, do not fear, for God has come to test you, and that his fear may be before you, so that you may not sin. Didn't we just talk about not falling into worshiping anything else to get you out of your situation or to free you from your situation, but just still worshiping God, no matter how bad things get? He says so that you may not sin. Interesting. Didn't we just talk about seeking intimacy with God and not running away from him and trying to add anything to what he's already done for you? Didn't we just talk about going forward in the midst of trials? These are all things that the singularity fear can grant you. Or I'm sorry, I should say that God can grant you should you have the singularity fear. Notice here, when Moses said, do not fear, for God has come to test you, and that his fear may be before you, so that you may not sin. He said, and that his fear may be before you. His fear. He assigned the fear to God. So let me ask you this. What fear do you have? Do you have the evil fear? Are you fearless? You don't bow to the circumstances, which you shouldn't, but you don't bow to God either. Or do you have God's fear? He said his fear, he literally just assigned it to God. Whose fear do you have? Because God's fear is the kind of fear that causes you to say, I'm going to go up to this mountain anyway and talk to him so we can give me the law. God's fear is the kind of fear that says, I don't care how hot the furnace gets, I'm going to go in anyway. God's fear is the kind of fear that says, I don't care how big the giant is, I'm going to go forward and battle anyway. Why? Why do these things happen? Oh, so God can be exalted. So God can be exalted. So God can be honored and magnified. And in this give you the victory, his victory granted to you, should you have this singularity fear. I'm going to leave you with this. I got one more point to make and I'm going to turn it back on you. If you look up the word singularity, now it has a lot of different definitions, but one definition for singularity the context in which a small change can cause a large effect. A small change can cause a large effect. I'm not saying that fearing God is a small change. It's definitely not. It's transformative. But a small change. One man anointed to lead a nation who says, I'm going to go up to the mountain. I'm going to go up to the mountain and receive the law by which God wishes to govern us. In Daniel 3, 3 men who said, I'm not going to bow down to your God or your idols. 3 men in an entire nation. 1 Samuel 17, one boy, one little boy. Who said, I'm not going to stand still while somebody curses God. I'm going to go forward and have victory. I'm not saying, once again, that fearing God is a small change, because it's not. But look at what can happen when you do this. The entire course of history was altered each time one person or a few people said, I'm going to do what God told me to do. And not what my flesh tells me to do, not what the world tells me to do, not what the devil tells me to do, what God told me to do. And he has the victory. If you remember earlier at the beginning of the video, I said that out of these three, there are two that God wishes to magnify himself in. Now, he can magnify himself in this still too, right? But my point is that as we saw from scripture and as we saw from the original text, from the original translation, when you try to bring what you got to what God's already offered, you pollute it. He is holy. He doesn't need your additions. That doesn't mean be lazy. That doesn't mean don't do anything with your life. He gave you those things so he can be able to honor, magnify, and exalt himself in you. That's why he gave you those talents. But when you tell God, what you did isn't good enough, I'm going to add myself, you not, it doesn't just, it says profane in the New King James Version, but the original Hebrew for that word as it was written when this text, when these accounts, when these historical events were first written down, when people first said, we got to write this stuff down, that original Hebrew word is used in congruence and synonymously with to pollute, which is why I wrote it in purple. Because purple reminds me of like a dirty river, or like, you know, when you would watch a cartoon and like, there would be like toxic gas or whatever, and like Batman cartoons, that's what that reminds me of. So that's why I put purple. So he's God. He can do whatever he wants. He can exalt himself over these things. However, I want to draw our attention particularly to this. And I want to ask you, are you going to be fearless? Because I know it sounds cool. I'm not afraid of anything. I'll go forward. Okay. But if you can't fear God, if you can't make a decision to submit yourself to God, to yield to God, to be humble, so that God can exalt himself, because it's not about you, it's about him. It's not about me, it's about him. If you can't make the decision to do this, God's going to have victory no matter what. You can either be in the singularity fear, where he gives you the victory, where he has the victory and grants it to you because you were submitted to him and you were under his authority and his dominion, and he loves you. So he allows you to take claim in the victory with him. Not that it's your victory, it's his. The battle is his, so therefore the victory is his too. What did David say? He said, this battle is the Lord's, therefore the victory is going to be the Lord's too. But because he loves you, you can take part, not in getting the victory. You have a part to play. He gives you a part to play because he loves you. You have to go forward. You have to choose not to bow. But he can grant you the gift of victory over this. His victory over this. But if you're going to be fearless, you're going to say, God, I don't want to bow down to you. I don't want to be subject to you. I want to do things my way. I want to be the God of me. He's going to have victory, but it's going to be over you. As we saw with Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar is lucky he didn't die. Not right there, at least. As we saw with Goliath. If you're going to sit here and say that my might and my spear and my shield and my armor, that's what Goliath was doing, or what make me greater than God? Because remember, Nebuchadnezzar, he wasn't just cursing Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He was cursing them, sure. He was threatening them, sure, but what he was really doing was defying God. What Pharaoh was really doing in Exodus was defying God until Exodus 14, which we talked about last week. What Goliath was doing was defying God. If you're going to say, I have all these things, God, I have the money, I have the car, I have the relationship, the house, the job. I don't need you, God. I have the spear, the shield, the sword, the armor, the size, the stature. I'm a big giant. I have all these things. I don't need you. I'm fearless. I don't fear anything and I don't fear you. He's just going to have the victory over you. And he's going to hand it to those who have the singularity fear. Going to give it to them. Because he can use them. They want to be used. No matter how difficult it gets, they want to be used. Even if they might die, as we saw in Daniel 3, when they were like, even if God doesn't save us, we're still not bowing down to you, even if it costs us our life. He can save us from the furnace, even if he doesn't, still not bowing down to you. Because we fear God. That's the victory. Let me ask you this. Are you going to be fearless, which sounds awesome, because you have so many things, or are you going to have the singularity fear? Goliath had all the stuff. He had the size, the stature, the weapons, the armor. God didn't need anything. God didn't even need David. God could have just struck Goliath down. God created Goliath. God could have struck Goliath down, but he chose to use David. Don't you want to be used? God doesn't need to use you, but he loves you. He chose to use David so that David could be elevated. David became the king of Israel, the greatest king they ever knew. One of the best kings in history. And when you think of how great David was, you have to think, even if you don't believe in him, you have to think of the God he served. Goliath's weapons and his spear and his armor didn't get him very far. In fact, it didn't get him anywhere. It got him killed, and the spears, weapons, armor, and the head were given to David as a trophy. All the things you think you need, that you have, that make you, not need God, that make God obsolete, it can be taken away from you and given to those who never needed it in the first place. They're going to hang it up in their tent as a trophy because they know they don't need it. They had God. That's how they got over you in the first place. That's how God was able to use them to magnify himself in the first place. It's not that he hates you, but he must be honored. He has to be honored. And you have all these things right now. You're saying, I have all the money and all the success and all this stuff. And I'm not saying money and success are bad by any means. But if you're going to worship them and not worship God, these things can be given to somebody who doesn't even need them because they have God. And while you're clinging on to them, while Goliath was so proud of his stature, was so proud of his armor, once he got killed, it was sitting in David's tent as a trophy. These things he clung on to, these things you're clinging on to, taken away, and somebody who never even needed it in the first place because they always loved God more. Don't you see what I'm saying? So, I'm going to wrap up. I'm done here. Prayerfully, I don't think there's anything else that God has for me right now. You cannot have the evil fear. You cannot have the evil fear. To flee from God. To add anything to what God's already done for you. To literally pollute it, to ruin it. To literally ruin it. You cannot have the evil fear. Shouldn't be fearless either, but God in his mercy let Nebuchadnezzar live through that. Nebuchadnezzar could have been burned too, or he could have just dropped dead. God has infinite ways to have killed Nebuchadnezzar. But instead, he was like, you know what? Their God's real. Not only is he real, he's tough. Or that's in mercy that God did that for him. Or you can be in the singularity fear, where God can use you to magnify his name at the highest level over the most impossible of threats. Because nothing's actually impossible with him. I just want you to think about that. Prayerfully, this message finds you and it finds you well. If you enjoy these videos, then definitely subscribe. I've got more videos coming out, Lord willing. We're going to keep the Bible studies. We're going to add some other things too. Because the purpose here for why I was put here is to help people be better. I want y'all to have the singularity fear. I want y'all to go do great things. I want you guys to know what you cannot be going into this next chapter and what God wishes to rescue you from, as we see here and as we saw last week with our study of Exodus 14. Love y'all. God bless.